Norway is home to some of the most beautiful landscapes in the world, but hidden within its serene cemeteries lie chilling tales of restless spirits and eerie encounters. Join us as we explore the 15 most haunted cemeteries in Norway, where the line between the living and the dead becomes terrifyingly blurred. Are you brave enough to uncover the dark secrets these graveyards hold? 1. Vår Frelsers Gravlund, Cemetery of Our Savior. Oslo, under the glow of the moon, Vår Frelsers Gravlund transforms into an otherworldly realm, steeped in silence, yet alive with unseen presences. The cemetery, located in the heart of Oslo, is a resting place for many notable figures, but not all who dwell there rest peacefully. One cold autumn night, a young man named Eric ventured into the cemetery, drawn by a dare. Armed with only a flashlight, he treaded carefully along the gravel paths, the crunch of his steps echoing ominously. Near an old, moss-covered tombstone, he noticed a faint figure in a black cloak standing still. Thinking it was a statue, he moved closer, but as his light illuminated the figure, its head slowly turned, revealing hollow, dark eyes that stared straight through him. Paralyzed with fear, Eric stumbled back, his flashlight flickering uncontrollably. The figure raised a skeletal hand, pointing toward the gate. A cold wind howled, and Eric heard a whisper, "Leave this place." Without hesitation, he fled, the sound of rustling leaves and footsteps close behind him, until he reached the gate. To this day, Eric refuses to speak of what he truly saw that night. But many believe the cemetery's ghosts warn intruders to respect the sacred grounds or suffer the consequences. 2. Gamla Aker Kirke Cemetery. Oslo nestled next to Oslo's oldest church, Gamla Aker Kirke Cemetery holds centuries of history and secrets that refuse to remain silent. Locals often speak of strange occurrences after nightfall, but few are brave enough to explore. One stormy evening, a student named Lena decided to photograph the ancient gravestones for a history project. She arrived just as the last rays of sunlight faded, casting the cemetery in eerie shadows. As she adjusted her camera near a crumbling tombstone, a cold shiver ran down her spine. She felt the unmistakable sensation of someone watching her. Through her lens, she spotted a woman in a tattered white gown, standing a few meters away, her back turned. Lena called out, but the figure didn't respond. When she lowered her camera, the woman was gone. A sudden gust of wind sent leaves swirling, and Lena turned to leave, but the sound of faint whispering stopped her in her tracks. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in an unholy chant. Looking back, she saw dozens of faint, translucent figures rising from the ground, their faces twisted in sorrow and rage. Terrified, Lena sprinted to the gate, her screams swallowed by the storm. To this day, her camera remains missing, but some say the spirits of Gamle Aker Kirke are etched into every photo taken there, trapped forever. 3. Kirka Oden Cemetery, Hamar. Perched beside the haunting ruins of Hamar Cathedral, the Kirka Oden Cemetery whispers tales of restless spirits. The peaceful facade of the graveyard is a mask, hiding centuries of tragedy and the souls who refuse to leave. One frosty winter night, a local historian named Anders ventured into the cemetery, hoping to document the gravestones for a research project. The snow blanketed the ground, muffling his footsteps, and a pale moon cast long, eerie shadows across the ancient graves. As Anders examined an old tombstone engraved with the name Clara Eidsvoll, a young woman who had perished tragically in the 18th century, he noticed faint footprints appearing in the snow, though no one was near. Before he could react, a chilling wail pierced the stillness. Turning toward the sound, he saw a translucent figure of a woman in a tattered gown gliding between the graves. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her hands outstretched as if pleading for help. Paralyzed with fear, Anders watched as she stopped and pointed toward a fresh grave. Then, she let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the ruins. Dropping his notebook, Anders fled, vowing never to return. Locals believe the woman is Clara herself, eternally mourning a lover lost to betrayal, and that her spirit rises to warn visitors not to uncover the secrets buried with her. 4. Nidarosdomen Cemetery, Trondheim. Surrounding the grand Nidaros Cathedral in Trondheim lies a cemetery shrouded in mystery. Its moss-covered tombstones and ancient trees whisper secrets of a bygone era, but those who linger too long often find themselves encountering more than they bargained for. One foggy evening, Ingrid, a tourist fascinated by the cathedral's history, decided to explore the cemetery. The air was heavy, and an eerie silence blanketed the grounds. As she wandered between the graves, she noticed a faint light flickering near a tombstone. Thinking it might be a candle, she approached, only to realize it was an unearthly glow emanating from the ground itself. Before she could step closer, a shadowy figure emerged from the mist. It was a man dressed in old clerical robes, his face obscured, but his form unmistakably human. "You shouldn't be here," a voice whispered, though his lips never moved. Terrified, Ingrid turned to run, but the ground beneath her seemed to shift, pulling her back toward the glowing grave. Desperate, she screamed, breaking the spell, and fled toward the gate. As she glanced back, the shadowy figure stood motionless, watching her leave. Locals say the spirit of a former priest haunts the cemetery, guarding the secrets buried beneath Nidaros Cathedral. Those who disturb his domain risk being drawn into the darkness forever. 5. Gamla Cemetery, Fredrikstad. Tucked away in the historic fortress town of Fredrikstad, Gamla Cemetery exudes a quiet unease. Its weathered tombstones tell tales of centuries past, but the stories whispered by locals warn of a darker presence that roams the grounds after sunset. One late autumn evening, Johan, a night watchman patrolling the old town, decided to cut through the cemetery on his way home. The air was still, and the dim light from his lantern cast long shadows across the graves. As he passed an ancient oak tree, he heard the faint sound of sobbing. Pausing, he shone his lantern toward the source of the sound, but saw nothing but empty gravestones. Then, the sobbing grew louder, transforming into an anguished wail that seemed to echo from all directions. Suddenly, he saw a figure emerge, a woman in a black veil, standing near a small grave. Her shoulders shook as if she were weeping, but when Johan called out, she slowly turned toward him. Beneath the veil was not a face, but a hollow void, endless and dark. Frozen in terror, Johan dropped his lantern and fled, the woman's cries following him until he passed through the cemetery gates. Locals believe she is the spirit of a grieving widow who lost her family during a plague, eternally mourning by their graves. Those who encounter her say she doesn't just watch, she takes a piece of their soul with her. 6. Stav Cemetery, Trondheim. Stav Cemetery in Trondheim, a tranquil resting place by day, becomes a realm of unease as night falls. Surrounded by dense trees and the faint hum of the nearby river, it's said to be haunted by a spirit who lingers restlessly among the graves. One rainy evening, a student named Marcus decided to take a shortcut through the cemetery on his way home. The rain was light but steady, muffling his footsteps as he moved through the winding paths. Halfway through, he noticed something strange. A man in a dark coat standing motionless near a headstone, his back turned. Marcus hesitated, calling out a polite greeting, but the man didn't move. As he took a step closer, the figure slowly turned, revealing a face pale as death, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the rain. The man lifted a finger, pointing toward Marcus, but said nothing. Panicked, Marcus turned and ran, but no matter how far he ran, the sound of wet footsteps followed closely behind. When he finally reached the gate and turned back, the figure was standing in the same spot, watching him, rain dripping from his lifeless face. Locals say the ghost is a railway worker who died, tragically, in a nearby accident and was buried in Stav Cemetery. His spirit is said to appear to warn those who wander alone, as if ensuring they don't meet the same fate. 7. Olund Cemetery. Olund. Nestled in the picturesque coastal town of Olund Cemetery hides a sinister reputation beneath its serene appearance. With gravestones weathered by time and sea winds, whispers of ghostly encounters echo among locals who dare to walk the grounds after dark. One foggy evening, a fisherman named Elias was returning home late after a long day at the harbor. Taking a shortcut through the cemetery, he noticed an unusual glow emanating from a gravestone near the center of the grounds. Curious, he approached, but the closer he got, the colder the air became. As Elias reached the grave, he felt a hand grip his shoulder. Spinning around, he found himself face to face with a translucent figure of a woman dressed in a long, flowing gown. Her eyes were hollow, her face twisted in sorrow, and her voice echoed like a whisper through the mist. "Leave this place. It's not your time." Paralyzed with fear, Elias stumbled backward, but the woman vanished before his eyes. Seconds later, he heard the faint sound of the church bell tolling, a sound no one had heard in years, as the bell had been removed long ago. Elias fled and vowed never to return. Locals believe the ghostly woman is the spirit of a widow lost in a shipwreck, forever wandering the cemetery in search of her loved ones. Those who see her are warned. Lingering too long may invite the same fate as the souls buried there. 8. Hogankirka Cemetery. Lofoten Cathedral Cemetery. Kabelvåg. In the rugged beauty of the Lofoten Islands lies Hogankirka Cemetery, its peaceful exterior concealing centuries of unsettling legends. The cemetery, shadowed by the majestic Lofoten Cathedral, is said to be haunted by the spirits of fishermen lost to the merciless sea. One chilly winter night, a local teacher named Marie walked through the cemetery, her lantern flickering against the icy wind. She was heading home after an evening at the church when she heard soft murmurs, as if a group of people were whispering in the dark. Turning her lantern toward the sound, she saw figures emerging from the mist, fishermen with hollow eyes and drenched clothing, as though they had just climbed from the freezing ocean. Frozen in fear, Mari watched as one of the figures stepped forward. His face was gaunt, his lips moving as if trying to speak, but no words came. Instead, she heard a voice inside her head. "Help us, we can't rest." Suddenly, the bell of the Lofoten Cathedral tolled, a sound that hadn't been heard in years. The figures vanished into the mist as Mari fled toward the village. She later learned the fishermen had perished in a storm decades ago. Their bodies never recovered, and the cemetery holds only symbolic graves for their souls. Locals believe these spirits rise during stormy nights, forever tied to the cemetery, searching for peace that will never come. Those who hear their whispers are said to carry their sorrow, haunted by visions of the unforgiving sea. 9. Kburkirka Cemetery. Kburkirka Cemetery, nestled near Norway's historic silver mines, holds an eerie reputation tied to the miners who met untimely deaths underground. By day, the cemetery seems serene, but after dark, a foreboding presence is said to awaken. One late autumn evening, a traveler named Eric found himself passing through the cemetery on his way to the nearby town. The cold wind whispered through the trees, and the faint glow of the moon illuminated the gravestones. As Eric walked, he noticed a strange metallic scent in the air, like the mines themselves had come alive. Suddenly, he heard the faint clinking of metal, as if a miner's pickaxe was striking stone. He turned and saw a shadowy figure bent over a grave, its movements jerky and unnatural. The figure slowly straightened, revealing a face covered in soot, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly silver in the darkness. The ghostly miner began moving toward Eric, dragging a rusted pickaxe behind him. Eric stumbled back, terrified, as the sound of clinking metal grew louder and louder, echoing all around him. Just as the miner raised his pickaxe, Eric turned and fled, his heart pounding as he escaped the cemetery gates. Locals believe the ghost is a miner who perished in a cave-in centuries ago, his body buried beneath the town. His spirit is said to wander the cemetery, forever searching for release from the darkness of the mines. Those who encounter him are warned to never look into his glowing eyes, lest they be cursed to relive his tragic fate in their dreams. 10. Tromo Cemetery. Tromo Cemetery, surrounded by the stunning Arctic wilderness, is a place of quiet reverence. But as darkness cloaks the land, whispers of ghostly apparitions transform this peaceful resting place into a spine-chilling nightmare. One frigid winter night, a journalist named Lena visited Tromo Cemetery to investigate stories of supernatural sightings for her column. Snow crunched under her boots as she navigated between graves, her flashlight casting eerie shadows across the tombstones. The icy silence was interrupted by faint footsteps echoing behind her, though no one was in sight. Suddenly, her flashlight flickered, plunging her into near darkness. A low, mournful humming filled the air, growing louder with each passing moment. Turning around, Lena saw a figure emerging from the snowstorm, a pale woman dressed in a thin, tattered dress, completely unbothered by the freezing cold. Her face was expressionless, but her empty eyes seemed to pierce straight through Lena's soul. The woman raised her hand and pointed toward an unmarked grave. "He's still waiting," the ghostly voice whispered. Before Lena could move, the apparition dissolved into the swirling snow, leaving only an unnatural chill in the air. Shaken, Lena fled the cemetery, but the humming followed her all the way to the gate. Locals later told her that the spirit of a woman who died waiting for her lover to return from sea is often seen wandering the cemetery. They warn that those who hear her voice too clearly risk being lured into the Arctic night, never to return. 11. Bergen Cathedral Cemetery. Bergen. The Bergen Cathedral Cemetery, tucked behind the centuries-old cathedral in Norway's second-largest city, carries a heavy weight of history and a dark aura that only intensifies under the moonlight. While most visitors find solace among its ivy-covered stones, those who linger too long after dusk often find themselves in the grip of something far more sinister. One evening, a photographer named Henrik decided to capture the beauty of the cemetery, with its ancient gravestones bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. As the light faded, Henrik wandered deeper into the grounds, his camera clicking with each shot. But when he tried to snap a picture of a particularly old gravestone, the camera malfunctioned. Frustrated, Henrik began to walk away, but something caught his eye, a faint light flickering between the tombstones. Thinking it might be someone else with a lantern, he approached, only to see a figure standing in the distance, illuminated by a strange, ethereal glow. The figure was a man dressed in 17th century clothes, his eyes wide with an unearthly sadness. He didn't move, but simply stared at Henrik, as if silently pleading. Then, as Henrik moved closer, the man's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Only a chilling wind swept through the cemetery. The figure disappeared into the mist as quickly as it had appeared. Terrified, Henrik fled, but he couldn't shake the image of the man's eyes following him as he ran. Locals believe the ghost is that of a long-forgotten priest buried in the cemetery, condemned to wander the graves for eternity, unable to find peace. Visitors say those who encounter him are marked, often experiencing disturbing dreams or feelings of unease for weeks afterward. 12. Sandefjord Cemetery. Sandefjord. Sandefjord Cemetery, located in the coastal town of Sandefjord, is a peaceful resting place during the day, with its carefully maintained graves and ancient trees. But as twilight settles over the land, the atmosphere shifts. Locals whisper of a chilling presence that stalks the grounds when the moon is high. One crisp evening, a couple, Lena and Eric, took a late walk through the cemetery after dinner. They had heard the stories of eerie occurrences, but dismissed them as mere folklore. As they strolled through the rows of graves, the wind howled through the trees, causing the branches to creak and groan. Suddenly, Lena felt a sudden cold chill. She turned to see a figure in the distance, standing near an old, crumbling grave. The figure was a woman in a long, flowing black gown, her face obscured by the hood of her cloak. As Lena called out to her, the figure began to walk toward them, but with each step, the ground beneath her feet seemed to crack open, releasing faint, ghostly whispers. Eric, feeling uneasy, urged Lena to leave, but the woman was now too close. Her eyes were hollow, and her skin was as pale as death itself. She spoke in a soft, haunting voice. "You shouldn't be here. He's not ready to join me." Before Lena and Eric could react, the woman vanished into thin air, leaving only a cold, empty space where she had been. As they ran out of the cemetery, they both felt a presence following them, its gaze heavy and unrelenting. The locals say the woman is the spirit of a widow who tragically died, waiting for her husband to return from sea. Her restless soul is said to wander the cemetery, drawn to those who dare to walk its grounds after dark, searching for a companion to join her in eternal sorrow. 13. Eidsvoll Cemetery. Eidsvoll. Eidsvoll Cemetery, set in the peaceful town of Eidsvoll, seems serene at first glance, with its rows of well-kept graves and quiet surroundings. But the cemetery hides a deep, unsettling secret, one that comes to life when the sun dips below the horizon. One cold autumn evening, a historian named Henrik was researching the grave of a famous local figure buried there. As the evening grew darker, he lingered too long, engrossed in his notes. The air grew thick with fog, and the cemetery fell silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As Henrik approached a weathered tombstone, he suddenly felt a strange pressure in the air. The temperature dropped, and his breath became visible in the cold night air. He looked up to see a figure standing near the tombstone, a man in a tattered uniform, his face twisted with sorrow and rage. The man was staring directly at Henrik, but his eyes were empty, as if his soul had long since departed. Frozen with fear, Henrik watched as the figure began to slowly approach him, dragging one foot as though he were walking through a thick, invisible fog. Henrik tried to move, but his body felt paralyzed, as if the ground beneath him had turned to stone. The man spoke, his voice a rasping whisper. "You don't belong here. Leave this place before it's too late." With a final chilling glance, the ghostly figure disappeared into the thickening fog, leaving Henrik alone in the cemetery. He fled, the whisper still echoing in his mind. Locals believe the spirit is that of a soldier who perished in the Battle of Eidsvoll in the 17th century. His restless spirit is said to roam the cemetery, warning anyone who dares to stay too long after nightfall. Those who encounter him are often followed by a lingering sense of dread, as if the very ground is cursed with the soldier's sorrow. 14. Mandal Kir Cemetery, Mandal. Mandal Kir Cemetery, set in the quaint coastal town of Mandal, offers a peaceful atmosphere during the daylight hours. But as dusk falls, the cemetery takes on a darker, more sinister energy. The wind whispers through the gravestones, and the distant waves crashing against the shore only seem to amplify the eerie silence that blankets the area. One evening, a young woman named Ingrid decided to take a walk through the cemetery after a visit to the nearby church. As the sun sank low in the sky, the cemetery grew darker, and an unsettling calm settled over the place. Ingrid's footsteps echoed as she passed the tombstones, her lantern casting long shadows on the ground. Suddenly, she heard faint murmurs, soft, unintelligible voices, seemingly coming from the graves around her. She paused, trying to make sense of the sound, but when she turned to look, the voices grew louder, filling her ears with a sense of urgency. Turning back, Ingrid froze in horror. A figure, cloaked in black, stood at the far end of the cemetery, watching her intently. The figure did not move, its face obscured by the hood of its cloak. As Ingrid took a step toward the figure, the air grew inexplicably colder, and the murmurs turned into a single chilling phrase: "You should not be here." Terrified, Ingrid tried to turn and run, but as she did, the figure suddenly appeared in front of her, its cold, dead eyes locking with hers. In a desperate panic, Ingrid pushed past the apparition, feeling its icy touch brush her skin as she fled the cemetery. Locals believe the figure is the spirit of a grief-stricken mother who lost her children to disease long ago. Her restless soul is said to haunt the cemetery, seeking to warn visitors away from its haunted grounds. Those who have dared to stay too long have reported hearing her mournful whispers, begging them to leave before it's too late. 15. Røros Cemetery, Røros. Røros Cemetery, located in the heart of the historic mining town of Røros, is a peaceful place during the daylight hours. However, when the sun sets and the harsh winds blow through the mountains, an unsettling atmosphere takes over, and the cemetery becomes a place of dread. One particularly cold winter night, a local historian named Eerie ventured to the cemetery to photograph the ancient gravestones, intrigued by the legends that surrounded the area. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he moved deeper into the cemetery, his breath visible in the frigid air. As the last traces of daylight disappeared, the cemetery grew eerily silent, the only sound being the howling wind. Suddenly, Eric heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate. He spun around, but there was no one in sight. He shrugged it off, assuming it was just the wind, or perhaps a trick of the shadows. But as he continued, the footsteps grew louder, closer, until he could almost feel a presence at his back. Turning once more, Eric saw a figure standing at the far end of the cemetery. An old man dressed in worn mining clothes, his face covered in soot and scars. The man's eyes were empty, as if his soul had been drained from his body. As Eric tried to approach, the figure raised a trembling hand, silently beckoning him closer. Fear flooded Eric's body, and he quickly turned to flee, but as he ran, the figure's hollow voice echoed in the air. "Don't leave. You're not finished here." Eric ran out of the cemetery, feeling an unseen force chasing him, the footsteps following him all the way to the edge of the town. The locals say the cemetery is haunted by the souls of the miners who perished in the deadly mines, their spirits forever trapped between the world of the living and the dead. Those who hear the footsteps or see the figures are said to be marked by the restless souls, forever haunted by their tragic past. These eerie cemeteries are not just places of rest. They're filled with ghostly legends that continue to haunt the land. Which one gave you the creeps the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more spine-chilling stories. Until next time, stay curious and stay haunted.